Large-scale war is always a spectacular accelerant of technological development. In 1914, for example, French and German cavalry trotted off to battle wearing dashing dress uniforms and splendid feather-festooned bonnets, and toting lances, sabres and carbines, which would not have looked massively peculiar to any of their forebears who may have crossed swords at Waterloo 99 years previously. By 1918, the fields across which those chasseurs, cuirassiers, hussars and dragoons had once charged their handsome horses were barbed wire-strewn swamps of muddy trenches from which soldiers in khaki and tin hats traded blows with machine guns, artillery, mines, gas, tanks and aeroplanes. Much of the paraphernalia of the current war between Russia and Ukraine has been familiar. It has also been a war of armour and artillery, infantry and air forces. But some of it would startle the veterans of conflicts as recent as Afghanistan and Iraq. The progress of drones during this war, not only in the air but on land and sea, has been extraordinary and exponential. The Turkish-built Bayraktar TB2 drone, which became such a totem of the early weeks of Ukraine's resistance 3 years ago that a folk ballad was composed in its honour, now seems a venerable antique. There is no reason to suppose that these advances will slow, much less stop. This compels us to wonder, as the world's militaries are surely now wondering, how warfare might change, and change significantly, in the near to medium term. Everything seems up for grabs when it has been demonstrated that a navy can be effectively defeated by a country with no ships, that expensive aircraft on runways thousands of kilometres from the front are vulnerable to swarms of cheap drones launched from trucks, that old-school infantry and armour manoeuvre has been rendered impossible by omniscient eyes in the sky. How will Ukraine's war change warfare for everyone else? To what extent will humans still be able to fight each other? And has the last fighter pilot already been born? This is the Foreign Desk.
It's a totally different arena of warfare than we've ever seen before.
The tank is like a dinner jacket. You don't need it very often, but sometimes nothing else will do.
There are those who want to learn the wrong lesson from Ukraine in saying that we don't need air power anymore, we can do it all with drones. That is an infantile set of thoughts and absolutely incorrect.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Monocle's Julia Lassica, who co-wrote for Monocle's June issue the story 10 Disruptors Taking Aim at Modern Warfare, profiling exactly that many companies who are helping to build the battle space of the future. Julia, first of all, just tell us a bit about the feature.
Yes, of course. So this was for our June issue of Monocle, and it was Monocle's executive editor, Chris Lord, and we were thinking, after the Munich conference back in February and then the subsequent sort of defence drive, when Donald Trump and his team very much made clear that Europe should stand on their own 2 feet. And then we saw this big kind of wave of activity sort of just picking up. I mean, we saw a lot of uptick in the last few years, I'm sure, which we'll talk about, but there really was like quite a surge of interest in defence and lots of sort of resurgences of companies after that time. And so we wanted to see which European defence companies, away from the big primes, so the big players in the industries across the Atlantic, in America and in Europe and across the world, we wanted to see specifically European defence startups because usually they're much more nimble, they're doing more interesting things, they're more inventive, creative, because they just have more freedom to move and to think, and they're not sort of weighed down by protocol and guidelines set up by big corporations and bureaucracies, etc. And we brought together this review of 10 defence companies, everything from armour to drones, of course, and to robots, transporting things on battlefields to ships, a broad spectrum of things from all across from Europe. So Sweden, Germany, Ukraine, Portugal. So really looking at kind of broad range of European defence startups. And the findings were really fascinating, really creative, ingenious projects going on right now in Europe to contribute to the continent's defence.
I mean, there are 10 very different different companies, as you suggest, doing all sorts of different stuff in lots of different places. But that notwithstanding, did any trends leap out at you from among the companies profiled?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the most visible trends was Ukraine. Everyone going there to test their equipment, to really make sure it actually works on the battlefield. Obviously, it's then used on the battlefield if it works. So it's actually an amazing litmus test. Some of the companies that really come out of nowhere, startups, they'll then send their equipment to Ukraine, and the Ukrainians will find, gosh, this stuff doesn't work at all. Here are some fixes that we propose. It's a really interesting time for companies to be able to so actively find out whether their equipment works or not, because normally in peacetime, I guess you'd make a product and then everyone would sort of assume, and you'd have this kind of unicorn of a product that everyone would assume this is sort of the top range. And then if there was ever a situation in which it was actually used in live combat, then actually soldiers would get really upset and frustrated because their lives would be in danger and they would find that this piece of equipment isn't particularly good. Now, that's one big trend. Everyone wants to make sure that equipment works, and so they're sending it to Ukraine. Also, another thing that I've noticed is lots of military personnel moving over from the army to private manufacturing ventures. That's a really big thing because they can see the gaps in European defence capabilities, because, I mean, the nature of warfare has totally and radically changed. I think if we think of like the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., those types of warfare, combat experiences are completely and utterly different to what is happening now in Ukraine on the battlefield with Russia and with Ukrainian soldiers. So lots of army people sort of waking up because of this experience and realising that European armies just don't have the capabilities that are required for modern warfare. And so really feeling that urgency and feeling like they really wanted to go and change the conversation that was happening. Another interesting thing, just to carry on, was people really integrating civilian and military trends now. So, for example, Spotify CEO, he's come under fire, really made headlines because he's been investing in a German defence startup that we featured in the review, Helsing. And that's taken a lot of people by surprise, but I think it just shows how much the conversation has changed, how much civilian and military sort of have come together actually now in Europe.
I mean, you're right to point out that Ukraine has, unfortunately for Ukraine, become a live action laboratory for testing new ideas on this front. And to remind our listeners, that is your home country we're talking about. But did you find that Ukrainian firms are out in front of this because they are literally in the thick of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a really interesting interview a few days ago from a Ukrainian drone manufacturer, the CEO of a drone manufacturer. And he was talking about how Western firms are going to Ukraine and actually stealing his secrets and sort of trying to pass them off as his own. And that's something that we really felt when we were putting this review together, was that Ukrainian firms have so much knowledge, so much sort of information and data and engineering capabilities that's just not present in Europe because it's not the same urgency. We featured one Ukrainian radio manufacturer called Chimera, and there they were talking about how overnight they just have to come up with a solution. So a soldier will get in touch with them from the battlefield. You know, he'll be a normal infantry soldier, for example. You know, they work with everyone, and that's what's so valuable, is they work from the very bottom of the ranks to the very, very top. And the infantry soldier will just get in touch with them and say, look, I've experienced this issue when I was in this particular place using the radio in this particular way. They'll fix it overnight so that he or she can then use it immediately the next morning or, you know, in a couple of hours' time, because literally their lives depend on it. I think in terms of drones, that's the kind of conversation now that everyone is having and that Ukrainians are really excelling in. Zelensky has said that apparently Trump is interested in buying Ukrainian drones. So we're seeing sort of endorsement of this manufacturing capability. China holds so much power in this conversation. They have so much of the technology. They have so many of the kind of components, etc. And what Ukrainians are able to do is make these little bits of machinery that are required to make a drone work. They've started to actually come up with that capability because China has really restricted exports to Ukraine, and it's so vital for Ukrainian protection of lives, reconnaissance, etc. Whereas we can see a comparison over in the US where that technology is just not catching up fast enough. And the Pentagon, you know, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary there, he's really put emphasis, as you've probably seen in that hilarious drone video. So we can really see that gap in capabilities is really, really present.
We will be talking later in the show with our imminent distinguished guests about where they see the future going. And that I know is hard to predict because everybody I've asked in this field has said something to the effect of like, yeah, the future is arriving in a matter of weeks. You know, what we were doing 3 months ago now just seems like you might as well be talking about cavalry charges and bayonets. But was there any consensus over where this might all take us months, years from now?
Yeah, humans not being present on the battlefield. And we can actually see that already in Ukraine. The first 200 meters in the front line within Ukraine, people don't go there. It's impossible. There's actually been a really interesting sort of report into this. Journalists can't get to the front line as they were able to even just a few months ago because it's now impossible. It's a no-go zone. What Ukrainian officials and defense ministers, etc., have been really putting emphasis on is the development of robots, robotics, robots that can go out and retrieve wounded soldiers, casualties, but also robots who can undergo, do missions, basically do reconnaissance and also kind of go in to hostile territory and perform different operations. That's the most important thing, I think, that we'll see. And that one of the companies that we did profile, Arx Robotics in Germany, they talked about in depth. They're based in Munich in Germany, but they were constantly traveling, organizing the interviews. We were constantly kind of negotiating where they will be. And a lot of the time they were actually in Ukraine. And that's something that the Ukrainians are really, really trying to work on. And the Europeans can see, the Americans can very much see. And I mean, if we look at any Chinese military video, it's just all robots, isn't it? It's kind of impossible now to be sort of a human because you're surrounded just by totally like inhuman forces buzzing around in the air, crawling around on the earth. It's a totally like different arena of warfare than we've ever seen before.
That was Monocle's Julia Lassica. You can read her piece 10 Disruptors Taking Aim at Modern Warfare on monocle.com or in the June issue if you can still find one. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. We are approaching the 109th anniversary of the first deployment in battle of what we think of as the tank, as the British Army's Mark I rumbled into the view of startled German soldiers defending the villages of Flers and Courcelette on the Somme. But after more than a century of history, how much of a future does the tank still have? Our next guest is Mark Urban, journalist, historian and author of the new book Tank, the 10 war machines that changed the world and the remarkable men behind them. Mark, first of all, before we get into the history, present and future of the tank, I want to ask you a bit about your own relationship with these machines, because you actually served in one at one point.
Very long time ago, yes, and I kept getting stuck and things kept happening to my tank that caused me to be the subject of jokes. But yeah, no, I did. Although the truth is, this was Cold War soldiering at the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s when, yes, you did some realistic things in terms of moving whole armoured divisions across the German countryside sometimes, which taught you all kinds of lessons. But really, I think most of my insight comes from having covered a lot of conflicts in which armoured vehicles were used and seen them, either being knocked out or succeeding in certain ways, and, the study of the history of it.
Because one of the recurring themes of your book is that people do keep confidently predicting the end of the tank almost as soon as it's almost as soon as it's first lumbered over the Somme in 1916.
Literally from the first action, the Germans are saying, what are the British playing at? How do they think they're going to be able to cross no man's land in these big metal boxes and not have us use our artillery, our field guns to just blow them apart? And at the Battle of Cambrai, which happened a little later, the following year, November 1917, there was a particularly skillful German battery commander who'd been training his gunners to deal with tanks. And in short order, they knocked out 30 or 40 of them. And the German generals surveying the battlefield afterwards went, oh, my Lord, this thing opened up like a sardine can with the sort of smell of burnt flesh inside. And who would possibly think that they could go to war in one of these things, So right from the start, this scepticism was there. And I think it's only in the interwar period that people start thinking, look, if we stop thinking about this problem in such narrow terms, how do we get across these few hundred yards of no man's land and design the machines to do something much more ambitious than that and say, well, okay, let the infantry punch the hole and then we flow through that hole. And then we just keep driving and we shoot up the enemy's command posts and supply dumps, and we cause the sort of collapse from within of their army. And that's blitzkrieg.
And yet, as recently as 2021, as your book notes, the UK's then Prime Minister Boris Johnson tells a parliamentary defence committee with his customary confidence that big tank battles on the European landmass are over. Very, very shortly after that, he was proved wrong. But is the Ukraine war, as you've seen it, a demonstration of the tank's virtues or its limitations? Because that initial mighty armoured assault by the Russians...
Oh, yeah, disastrous.
It just didn't work, and it has barely proceeded since.
Yes. Well, I think several different things going on at the same time there, and in a way... both halves of your alternative are actually true. I think it both illustrates that there are some profound problems with the tank, particularly in the way that Western countries have developed it. In other words, that it's so huge and expensive and complex that it's very hard to either change the design in response to things happening on the battlefield, whereas the Ukrainian drone warfare people are working on a 6-week cycle in terms of enhancements on what they're doing. So, a tank is much harder, particularly the way we build them in Western countries, hundreds of thousands of component parts, millions of lines of software code. So, yes, they're very expensive. And if you get one knocked out by a $50,000 drone and it's cost you, 20 times that to acquire, that's a big problem. But on the other hand, if you sit there on the Ukrainian front line and you talk to the soldiers and you look at the next tree line, and the whole battle in the Donbass has been over these tree lines with people sort of digging in them. And then I think you do still have a role for it, because this point of getting from tree line to tree line is what has defeated both the Ukrainians trying to recapture their occupied land and the Russians in trying to, complete their capture of those Donbass, the key districts.
All that being said, are you surprised that the Ukraine war has prompted something of a resurgence in interest in the tank, especially among European countries, the most obvious example being, and you refer to it in the book, that huge order that Poland has placed for 1,000 K2s from South Korea, which is a colossally expensive vehicle?
There is definitely going to be reinvestment going on, and there needs to be a sort of fundamental change of industrial paradigm, because the Leopard 2, which you might say has emerged with some credit from the Ukraine war, it's not perfect, but generally the feeling is there's not many weapons on that list that can knock it out when it goes forward. They were making 24 a year before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, so that's not going to solve your problems. You need to fundamentally rethink the way you make them. And that, I think, we've yet to see. But undoubtedly, Rheinmetall and Krauss-Maffei and the companies that make those vehicles in Germany, they are thinking about this. The other thing I'd just say quickly, Andrew, in response to your point about what do we learn from Ukraine, the Ukrainians have got sort of mixed views, particularly about these very big, heavy, expensive Western tanks.
Like the Abrams in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. They had bad experiences because it is a Cold War design, that one. But what they like, when you tell them what would you like more of, they like the Bradley and they like the Marder and they like the Swedish CV90. Now, when you say, well, what are they? They are what are called infantry fighting vehicles. So they're quite heavily armoured, not as heavily armoured as a tank. They can carry soldiers, and they have a weapon on top in a turret. And the reason they like those is this whole business of getting from one tree line to another. It can carry the infantry forward, so they can then get into trenches or whatever, take that space. And whether or not you're just taking forward people to change the batteries on your drones, or whatever it is, to pilot them or launch them, you will still need to transport people across battlefields for the foreseeable future. And that's why I think they find those particularly valuable and useful.
Which is a partial answer to what I guess is the big question, which is there always going to be something that a crewed tank can do that a completely remote-controlled one couldn't? Because this is the armoured warfare version of the angst, which I know is now consuming air forces and navies. Like, are we still going to need all the really cool stuff like fighter jets and destroyers and aircraft carriers, or can this all be done from the comfort of our own homes?
Well, there's a quote in the book from an Australian Major General, Catherine Toohey, yeah, who was given the task in the early 2020s of defining the Australian Army's equipment needs for the future. And so, of course, she had to answer this question. And she said, a tank is like a dinner jacket. You don't need it very often, but sometimes nothing else will do. Now, I think she's right. And I think what we've learned from, for example, the Russian actions in Mariupol or Israel's actions in southern Lebanon or Gaza more recently is that there are circumstances where tanks are still very much needed and counterintuitively often in built-up areas. So its role is more limited, but it's to do with the power of the big gun in the turret. This thing, when it goes off, it's like the end of the world. I mean, the report from one of those big, powerful tank guns and the kinetic energy it puts behind the projectile, either to sort of split apart another heavily armoured vehicle or to fire a great slug of high explosive down the street. So that's what effectively guarantees its survival, I think, for the coming, in the near term and medium term, I would say.
Mark Urban, thanks for joining us. That was Mark Urban. His new book, Tank, The 10 War Machines That Changed the World and the Remarkable Men Behind Them, is out now. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Perhaps no arm of the military seems as vulnerable to the advance of drones as air forces. A drone is vastly cheaper than a combat aircraft, is in some respects arguably as effective, and causes much less of a headache if your opponent shoots one down. Our final guest is retired US Air Force General and former fighter pilot Philip Breedlove, who served as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe from 2013 to 2016. He spoke to us at this year's GlobeSec Forum in Prague. I began by asking General Breedlove about Operation Spider's Web, that extraordinary Ukrainian enterprise to strike Russian airfields a long way behind the lines. How significant a moment was that in terms of the future of air power, especially in demonstrating the vulnerability of airfields?
I must tell you that if you're paying attention to what's going on in Iran, the very same model was used to get drones deeply into Iran that were a part of that first strike. So we are seeing a very new addition to the repertoire of how air power brings capability to a fight. There are those in the world who want desperately to learn the wrong lesson from Ukraine in saying that we don't need air power anymore. We can do it all with drones. That is an infantile set of thoughts and absolutely incorrect. But the drones are going to bring a new dimension to air power, which is very, very important. I was recently talking to an acquisition official from Ukraine, and he said to me, next year we're going to buy 1.3 million drones. And I know how many they fly. I know their battle rhythm. I know what's going on over there. And I'm thinking that is a really big number. And I said, why 1.3 million? And he said, because I've got to get 600,000 of them to the target. If you think about that math, 700,000 expected to be lost, a 58% or so attrition rate. And why is that? Because right now, the Russian Air Force has been unable to build air superiority over their troops.
We've spoken about this before, yeah.
And Ukraine, although small, mighty, and brave, have not enough capability to build air superiority over their troops. So drones are flying rather freely through airspace. They are getting attrited. But if either side had established air superiority, drones would be in a very different category. A drone taking off from your area, if it's flying through your air superiority, more of them are going to get to the target.
But isn't that being able to absorb attrition the strength of drones? Because obviously you can't put up an enormous wave of crewed aircraft in the assumption you'll lose half.
So, yes, that is an advantage. And of course, drones are very limited in their capability to deliver the effects of precise weaponry coming from more traditional air power.
Is that always going to be the case, though?
Well, so far it's proving we thought that, this is going to really get good. But what we have figured out watching Ukraine, who, by the way, are the best in the world at drone technology right now, what we see is the faster they get better, the better the defense gets. They have to change, then the defense gets better. So these drones are inflicting a lot of damage, but with an attrition rate of around 58% or more, they're not yet decisive on the battlefield. Have we run Russia off the battlefield?
Well, indeed not. But
And has Russia run Ukraine off the battlefield?
also, indeed not.
Yeah.
But I did speak to people about drones in Ukraine, and you're right. For obvious reasons, they have become world leaders in this. But people were telling me that generations of improvement in drones are now measured in weeks, not months, not even years.
You're right. And that's kind of what I was talking about. The OODA loop of how you defend is literally Ukraine is developing something to thwart a Russian defense. They get it to the field and they're testing it by using it, making changes, and already within weeks, they're reiterating corrections to the correction they just made. Their innovation is beyond imagination, and they are so concerned about capability on the battlefield, they're willing to fail to understand how not to fail, and they are teaching us how we should do acquisition. Meanwhile, we in the West develop some kit, years and years and years of testing, make a decision for production, a couple of years to get in production, we get it to the battlefield, and it's completely, in some cases, irrelevant. And this is called the Valley of Death in America, from building something to getting it to the battlefield. And we've got to take a Valley of Death that's sometimes 5 to 7 years, and we've got to get down into the category that Ukraine is in, which is days and weeks.
But does that narrow the prospects in future for crewed aircraft? Because obviously, as I don't know to tell you, fighter aircraft are extremely expensive. It takes years to develop, research, test, etc. You've already said no. You think there's still going to be a role for them?
No, this is the other lesson we don't want to learn from Ukraine. Because the Russian Air Force has failed, and because the Ukrainian Air Force, although it is small, brave, and very innovative, they are small and brave because we disarmed that nation in 1994, if you remember. So these two air forces have not done what Western air power has done. Do you know the last time that an American was killed by fixed-wing piloted aircraft?
Off the top of my head, no.
May of 1953. In the Korean War. We have put air superiority over every battlefield. Now, just recently, we had a drone kill some American airmen in Jordan, if you remember that. But it was a drone, and we know what happened. We mistaked it for a friendly drone and let it in. But the fact of the matter is, we have had air superiority over fielded troops since that time. And that enables our troops to do things they could never do if a bunch of drones were buzzing around up there and not providing air superiority.
But is it not conceivable that drones could be produced and deployed in such mass that they do make that traditional idea of air superiority impossible?
You're asking an airman, and my answer is no. But I also have been a joint commander, and I think multiple times I've been a joint commander and an alliance commander, not only joint, but multiple nations in coalition. So I think the future is very bright for what we are calling now manned-unmanned teaming. And in America, we talk about loyal wingmen, where we take highly capable, very stealthy aircraft to penetrate with loyal wingmen, and then with a human in the loop in that cockpit, deploying against what we see, rather than where intelligence told us it can be. Again, what happened to Russia and Ukraine. They launched against known positions, and they blew up a lot of empty airfields, and they blew up a lot of decoys. Okay? I think the future is man-to-man teaming. That's where I think the future is.
With all due acknowledgement of the sort of the old joke about how you wouldn't start from here, if we were starting from here, if the United States just woke up tomorrow and decided, okay, let's settle this, what could the United States still plausibly do for Ukraine?
There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot. Americans, rightfully so, feel that we've already given Ukraine a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's true, but we haven't given them a small fraction of what we would have given an American unit if it was going forward to fight. Mm. We've given Ukraine stuff on the margins. And people say, but the cost. Comparing any 2 days during intense fighting during World War I or World War II versus what we have spent in total helping Ukraine, there is no comparison. War is immensely more expensive than peace. And so the idea is we should invest in keeping the peace. And I think if early in this war we had put air and naval presence in this theater, we could have precluded what we see now.
But is it from where we are now? Is it still actually winnable from here?
Yes.
But how? What do the Ukrainians need specifically?
Well, I'll just say one more time. If we had an American or a NATO force on the ground fighting, we have a complete list of what we should be giving Ukraine. Okay? And so my biggest concern is Russia, from Belarus all the way around into the Black Sea and the southern Black Sea, has been firing into the complete depth of Ukraine with long-range, rather imprecise, but long-range fires into Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And we have limited Ukraine to a tiny fraction of that numbers of capabilities to fire back in Russia. If we were simply to give Ukraine the ability to kill Russian forces deep in Russia before they are brought to bear, this would be a very different war. Imagine, did you ever study or look at what we call the Highway of Death out of Kuwait?
This is in 1991.
Yeah, yes. And what air power did to that force on the ground? Imagine Western air power hitting the Russian army that was nearly completely bogged in the mud to the north of Ukraine.
But the inevitable response to that is, of course, the concerns that people have about antagonizing Russia, which they might not have about antagonizing a non-nuclear armed adversary. Do you think Russia is a total paper tiger in that respect, and that
no
threat should not be taken seriously?
We have to acknowledge that Russia could and might use nuclear capabilities. Mr. Putin talks about it all the time.
He does.
If you look at the history of this last part of this war, it's almost on a 10-day basis. Somebody in that Lavrov up area brings up nukes. They want us scared of nukes. They want to remind us about nukes. Mr. Putin recently said, I sure hope we can get through this war without having to use nukes, because he knows that absolutely deters Western capitals. Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Reagan, Presidents Kennedy and Reagan, they faced the same problems and they chose to act. We haven't had any presidents since then who are of that ilk. Nobody with that kind of moral courage.
That was General Philip Breedlove, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for the Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces the Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.